Hello, everyone. So this session, we're going to be talking about how we can mainstream the Paris Principles in your daily work. And I want to make it as close as possible to your work on migration as well. So it's something a bit more concrete, a bit more relatable, and that we're not talking about an abstract text that we don't find really that relation or that connection with. So this is what I hope that you get after this session. I hope that we will all have a better understanding of what are the Paris Principles, why they are relevant, and how you can use it in your work. But I also hope that you can consider how it can strengthen not only your national work, but also your regional and international work on migration. So as I said, I'll try as much as possible together with you to connect the Paris Principles with your work on this topic. And finally, I hope that we'll all see the Paris Principles as a source of common ground with other institutions. Based on the needs assessment that we had and that you filled in, we saw that many of you are familiar with the Paris Principles, but not many of you are familiar with the details of it. For instance, what does it mean? Let's say the principle of independence, what does it mean concretely? I'm sure all of you know about it, that it's important. So we hope that we'll, in this session, discuss a bit more concretely what does this mean, for instance, when you work on migration. And we'll also see how does the Paris Principles relate to other standards or other documents of reference that are coming up. So this is a bit what we're going to discuss. So basically in this presentation, I want you to invite really to look at the Paris Principles not as a document, a piece of paper that has like 3 pages in a Word document, but to first invite you to look at the Paris Principles as a compass. That means as something, as standards that can guide you in your work to be independent and effective. So it's really a guide for you to help you to understand how to do your work. So that's the perspective of the Paris Principles as a compass. The other way of looking at the Paris Principles is looking at it as our common DNA. And that's very important because it brings that solidarity element that it's so important. And that's also what ENRI tries to provide to our members. And finally, one way to look at Paris Principles is looking at it as a ladder, because alone it is just a text, but it can also serve as a basis to improve your standing at the national level, at the regional level. And as we're going to see, based on that, based on the text, we were able to really create an infrastructure and a landscape of human rights that make you stronger on your national work. So that's why we use the metaphor as a ladder that we can build on. So I mean, some history, I'm not going to be very long because I think it's it's a bit boring. That's something you can read online. But just to say that, this, even though there are institutions that precede the UN Paris Principles, the idea of having principles that bring these institutions together slowly came up in the 80s, and they finally were brought together in the early 90s, when a group of NHRIs brought together to discuss what they had in common, what are their principles. And this was a workshop that's where they, the NHRIs wrote down all these principles, and this was later endorsed by the UN and then by the UN General Assembly in a resolution in 1993. And that's where the official story, let's say, of NHRIs begin. And since then, there's been an explosion of NHRIs globally, and also previous institutions that, for instance, were ombuds institutions or did not have the mandate as close to the Paris Principles as possible, adapted their work to become Paris Principles compliant. In Europe, we had the same approach, where we saw the number of NHRIs in Italy increase exponentially since the 90s. And gradually, they were recognized as key actors at the national, regional, and international human rights infrastructure. As you know, the Paris Principles is also the basis for accreditation, and I'm not going to go into detail on how accreditation works, but it's also important for that because it's based on these principles that you receive the stamp that you are compliant with these principles, and this gives you not only a credibility as an independent and effective actor, but also, for instance, special powers for representation and participation at the UN and other regional forum. Of course, the Paris Principles as a UN General Assembly is just alone, it means nothing. So it has to be translated into national into the domestic legal order. It's up to the state to decide exactly how this is going to be done, as long as it's compliant with the principles. So that's why there are differences between your organizations as well. That's why, although you have this thing in common, it will be different depending on where you are. There are different types of NHRIs, and although these are archetypes, of course, in reality, it's not as separated in different types as we see here. But usually, institute type of NHRIs will be more focused on research and evidence-based advice to government and parliament, while commissions would usually be either a single member body, for instance, with a strong commissioner, or it can also be a multi-body, for instance, a board of commissioners that work together. And they usually have a very strong power of investigation of human rights violations, and also strong legal power as well. Usually it's where you see those who have the mandate to provide advice to the courts and act as amicus curiae. You also have consultative commissions, which is a special type of commission, let's say, that are usually formed by a large board, a large decision-making body with representations from civil society organizations and other sections of society. Finally, you have ombuds type institutions, and usually they're usually connected to the parliament, and they usually have the mandate to receive individual complaints and follow up on individual cases. But again, this is just the basic, right? The reality is a bit more complex than that. You have hybrid types as well. If you want to know what are the Paris Principles, of course, have to refer to the UN Paris Principles and as adopted by General Assembly. But one very important source is the general observations by the Subcommittee on Accreditation. So the UN Paris Principles often have very general language, or language that are not really understandable in the contemporary context. So that's why the Subcommittee on Accreditation, they create this general observation. So they will say, the principles of independence, what does this mean exactly? And then they will really lay down what does it mean, what is required, how does it impact on, throughout your work as an NHRI. So that's why it's very important to refer not only to the Paris Principles, but also to the general observations as this explanatory document, that's an explanatory resource. In addition to that, you do have, after the Paris Principles, you had the recognition of NHRIs through different documents at the UN level. For instance, you have annual General Assembly resolutions on NHRIs. And also at the regional level, for instance, you have Council of Europe recommendations on NHRIs. So nowadays we have a variety of documents of reference. And in addition, you have other more recent documents or studies that really help us understanding what are the Paris Principles and how they are understood in practice. One example being the FRA study that we mentioned. One important thing to be aware is that none of these standards should be below the Paris Principles. So the Paris Principles are the bare minimum that NHRIs to have in mind